Welcome to the Phoenix LiDAR Systems November 2020 webinar. Today's topic is LiDAR in animal landscape ecology applications, one of our more interesting topics. We at Phoenix LiDAR do LiDAR integration on a number of manned and unmanned vehicles for traditional LiDAR use, surveying, oil rigs, power lines and such, but animal landscape ecology is something different and something very interesting that we were happy to bring to this discussion. Let me introduce to you Corey Kellum, who is one of our top GIS engineers and members of our post-processing team, and he's going to be managing this discussion. So Corey, on to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Lido. Let's get started here. Thanks. Next slide. Okay. So yeah, welcome everyone to another installment of our Webinar Wednesday series. And today we have an exciting panel discussion talking about LiDAR applications in animal landscape ecology. And we have fantastic panelists from Harvard University's Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. And he will explain or discuss with us a little bit about how he uses remote sensing technologies to answer ecological questions focused around animal landscape interactions and how animals influence ecosystems. So today's outline, it looks like we'll start off with a panelist introduction. I'll introduce our panelist, and then we'll move on to a discussion with him to talk about some of his current research and some future research that he hopes to do. And also we'll leave some time at the end to answer some questions from any attendees that have any questions. So as you all are listening and you have a question, just type it into the chat and we will do our best to answer all of your questions at the end before some closing remarks. So without any further ado, let's introduce our panelists. So today we are lucky to have Evan Hawkeridge joining us, and he's a PhD student at Harvard University's Davies Lab, and he has an extensive background in UAS remote sensing, and he is most interested in ecosystem engineers. So I'm going to hand it off to Evan to tell us a little bit about himself, about Davies Lab, and to explain to us what an ecosystem engineer is. So welcome, Evan, and thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corey. And thank you for everyone at Phoenix for hosting this talk. I really hope it is interesting and useful for anyone listening if you are, whatever industry you're in and whatnot. So as Corey mentioned, I am a PhD student in the laboratory Dr. Andrew Davies, or in the kind of Harvard vernacular, Davies Lab. Corey mentioned ecosystem engineers. That's sort of my sub-niche field of interest. And really, pretty much everyone is familiar with some form of an ecosystem engineer. What they really are any species. It could be an animal, it could be a plant, a protist, you name it, that physically restructures the ecosystem in which it lives. It can do that through its own body or through manipulations to gather resources or create habitat. And by doing so, they effectively create new opportunity for other species. A good example of that in North America is something like the American beaver, or I apologize for that jingle, there's a house phone. But something like the American beaver, which create dams on bodies of moving water, which then can create beaver ponds, which are useful habitat for things like amphibians and fish and aquatic birds, as well as create space for trees and herbaceous vegetation that live outside of the pond, that do a little bit better near water bodies, stuff like that. So they play this really critical role by adding variation and variety to the landscape where there potentially wasn't there before. Another good example in North America is the prairie dog, and they create these underground towns in sort of the rangelands in the middle of the country that have this really important effect by they pull nutrients up to the surface and make that available to other plants and animals to graze on, and really promote biodiversity and stability in that ecosystem. So ecosystem engineers play this really critical role. Corey, if you don't mind going to the next slide.
Absolutely, yeah. We'd like to hear about that. Please give us some highlights about the Davies Lab where you work.
Yeah, sure thing. So we are a new-ish lab. Dr. Andrew Davies started his position at Harvard of July of last year, 2019. So pretty recent. I was his first graduate student. I joined a month later. So for a while, it was just us. That's why this picture of Davies Lab is just him and I, because at the time it was pretty much two of us. But we're now like 14 people. So we've grown a lot, but due to COVID, we've never all been in the same place at the same time. So there will hopefully be in the future, there will be another presentation by myself or someone else in the lab, hopefully, and there'll be a more full picture of faces. So that's myself on the right, Andrew on the left. And our lab really studies this topic of animal-landscape interactions, which encompass lots of things. So that it encompasses things like ecosystem engineers, which are animals that shape landscapes, but it's also highly interested in how landscapes determine behavior and outcomes, things like reproductive success and predation in animal communities. So it goes both ways. It also is interested in how changes in either the animal community or the landscape itself through things like human influence or like big storms, like really rare events or fire, may shape outcomes for both ends of that spectrum, the animal and the landscape. To do this, though, you really do have to combine lots of technologies. So drone LiDAR is sort of our cornerstone for getting especially the landscape data, and we'll talk more about that. But we also combine other things. We combine GPS telemetry on animals, camera traps, spaceborne remote sensing technologies, you name it. And we kind of span, a bit of a spectrum of methods and technologies to get this type of work done.
That's great. And was there something else you wanted to say?
Nope. Handing it off to you.
Okay. I see you have your big hats on here. That's really important when you're out in the field, not getting your ears sunburnt. I'm sure it's quite warm out there in the African savanna.
Yeah, especially in the summer, which the South African Southern Hemisphere summer. That's a picture from Kruger National Park in South Africa, and it gets very, very toasty at the time of year, and that creates challenges, which I believe we're going to talk about in a little bit for operating.
Sounds good. Yeah. So I'm curious, can you give us a little bit of a background and talk about how much do animals influence the ecosystems? Like, for example, I see an elephant here, and I can only imagine as this elephant is marching through the African savanna that it alters the landscape around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a really good question. And to be honest, in a sense, it's kind of not open-ended, but even in the scientific community, the actual role of animals in these kind of like large-scale landscape processes. And when I talk about a landscape in this, or an ecosystem in this context, ecosystem is essentially like a buildup of different organisms and abiotic factors sort of interacting. A landscape is like a mosaic of ecosystems. It's a very large area, and on the picture on the right, you have an elephant. It's an African savanna elephant. It's the largest terrestrial animal alive today. And on the left, you actually also have a picture of those same species. You have a group of them in the middle, but look how tiny they look, right? They're so small in comparison to the rest of the landscape. And this is one of the reasons why for a long time in ecology, and even still today, I think I had a professor in undergrad who was a plant ecologist, and he was very keen on, animals have local effects, not so much big scale process effects. You can kind of see why that would be the case, right? Most of this image is vegetation, and this is a small chunk of land. This picture is maybe 10 hectares, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I would consider a landscape something in the ballpark of thousands. You can get some information with a couple hundred, but truly, if you want to know what's happening in that mosaic of ecosystems, you really need to kind of blow it up. I do believe I have some pictures in the next slide, though, that can kind of show, why this is. You can really start, once you're having some perspective with modern techniques, you can start kind of seeing how there's more complexity here. So the picture on the right, you have two elephants. Once again, they look really small. Those are roads. And Corey, as you might guess, those are not roads on the left. That's the main point of these two images together. Those are a lot less, they're a lot more, I guess like webby looking on the left. Those are
elephant trails on the left?
Essentially, yeah. There could be other animals as well. I would imagine elephants really produce the largest and some of the most dramatic in the landscape. There's not a lot of study done on, which we hope to kind of branch out and do, on specific trail networks in savannas. There is some work on forest elephants and different types of trails and what their trails look like. These are animal paths. And what you notice, first of all, there are lots, right? They're all over this image. The other thing you notice is you look at this longer, you start to notice kind of subsequent things. And for me, first of all, what you notice is that animals very clearly are not using all of the landscape evenly, right? They're using specific places. You also start to notice little locations, which are actually mostly termite mounds, which we'll talk about later, or might be things like wallows, which are areas where animals essentially roll in mud to get off parasites as well as cool off and stuff like that. You start to notice is there are places where lots of animals from different directions are coming and converging. And the third thing you notice is that these trails actually extend off the edge of the image. They are very clearly going to very specific places. And this is really important because animals, as these sort of like mobile agents that can create trails, which then obviously suppress plant growth in those places, stuff like that, are moving to very specific places for resources. It might be shelter, it might be food or water, but they essentially are not using all of the landscape equally the same. This is important because where they spend most of their time, wherever that is in a specific animal, it adjusts those specific locations differently than the rest of the savanna matrix, the rest of the landscape. And it creates really, really potent local effects. And it can actually create habitat for other types of plants that do better in these modified environments, or insect species that do well in those environments, or even bigger animals, which we'll talk about more at the end, on how engineers can actually influence other animals. And basically, even with this like just a single aerial image, you can see that even though these animals are small in the landscape, they can start building up big effects. And kind of like the last image in this this kind of idea. If you go to the next slide, Corey. Yeah, so right here, this is a colorized point cloud. If you have the question, how do animals affect these landscapes at bigger scales, at regional scales? This image really kind of drives that point home. On the right, you notice there's far fewer trees. There's also lots of animal paths. You don't really have those animal paths on the left. And there's also far more trees, and I'll give you a secret. You can't tell in this image, but there are bigger trees on the left as well. And what's happening here is you might notice there's actually a road right in the middle, and then there's actually a kind of like two straight lines. That's a fence. And that fence creates an animal exposure on the left side. And basically, these animals are kept out of the left side, and they're allowed on the right side. The right side is like normal savanna. It's actually a gated area on the left. And what basically happens is when animals are excluded from at least this type of savanna in this specific place in Southern Africa, it's an arid savanna, and it's a specific type, essentially, arid granitic savanna. What basically happens is the animals are what makes it a savanna. If you go into that exclosure on the left, it looks much more like a forest. Grass is
so dense.
Yeah, it's extremely dense. It's a very dramatically different landscape. So really, the animals, despite the fact that they're so small and they move through as individuals, really are what form this type of savanna and this type of place. So they really do have large scale regional effects. I can go into examples forever. I mean, I have hundreds. I love this topic. So if you have anything for to ask.
Oh, absolutely. Well, before we get too far into it, I know that you're using LiDAR and remote sensing technologies to collect this data. So let's take a step back and let's look at which LiDAR system you're actually using to collect this data, and which platforms you're using to collect the data.
Yeah. So they're both really good questions. So we use the Ranger LR Lite system by Phoenix. So the Ranger LiDAR being the Ranger LR, I guess, being kind of like the upper echelon of LiDAR platforms. And we also have the Sony A6000 modified by Phoenix on there. So I think it's 24 megapixel APS-C, as well as the PT640 thermal sensor. And it really helps us. For a lot of reasons, we need kind of like a very small package. The whole thing weighs only 5 kilograms. So it really, the light nav box really kind of brings that weight down and makes it more adaptable for our needs.
That's great. What kind of flight times are you getting, do you know, with this system?
So it depends on the aircraft. So we kind of fly it on 3 different platforms. The first one was the M600. which I got to say was there's a lot of heads that were kind of curious why like us putting it on it, because I believe the M600 has like a 6 kilogram payload capacity more or less. And you know the LiDAR weighs 5 kilograms. You throw on a GPS antenna for the sensor. You throw on all these mounting points, and you get pretty close to that maximum. And we threw on the heavy batteries too. However, I say it flew great. We flew over 100 flights in 20 days. I think it's 140 flights. I think is our number. And no problem at about 14 to 17 minute flight time, depending on how confident we felt they could get back in time. So that flew great. But we recently upgraded to an Alta X by Free Fly Systems, which pushes our flight time up a lot to about 25 to 30 minutes.
That's really impressive.
Yeah.
So when you're flying these, what's that?
We've been really happy with it so far.
Well, that's great. So when you're flying these systems, I'm curious, you're flying these systems over wildlife. Is there any kind of concern for noise pollution? Are you flying so high it doesn't matter? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so very good question. So we're kind of in the early stages of that. So there has been work done on certain animals and drone noises, and some of those studies have been kind of odd. There's one study in particular where a person basically flew a drone at a grizzly bear and concluded that the grizzly bear did not like the drone. And like obviously, if you're flying it basically at it, that's going to be the case. We've noticed. It's interesting. So I do believe a lot of the animals notice the drone. When we fly it in an area, there may be animals there in the beginning, and usually the animals leave. Although some animals seem not to care at all. I would say we know that
larger or smaller.
Mostly larger animals don't seem to care, but I do think animals have a reaction. Elephants have a particular reaction. So it kind of depends on the species. We do take it into account somewhat. So we do actually fly pretty high anyways, so it's not really that much of a problem. But we have plans for future projects where we actually are in our research plans, including things like observing how animals are reacting, and if it's truly interacting their behavior or affecting their behavior, adjusting our flight parameters accordingly. So things like maybe taking steeper descents, so that way the loudest portion of the noise is when the drone is low. So, descend only over us and climb only over us, stuff like that. As well as potentially avoiding certain animals. But as of now, I guess the interaction between noise off the drone and the animals isn't so much to where we're that concerned. It doesn't seem to particularly stress me out.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay. And then to sum up, so you have a LiDAR sensor, you have an RGB sensor, and a thermal sensor. Got it. We'll talk a little bit more about all that data that you're collecting. Anything more on a LiDAR system before we move on to talk about workflow and data management?
No, I think we'll hold it because I do believe we're going to probably discuss, outcomes and whatnot.
Sounds
so I think
good.
Hold it for that.
Yeah. So I know that you're out in the African savanna. You must face many challenges of being in a remote area, a hot environment, collecting and processing data in the African savanna. So what kind of challenges do you face? And what can you tell us about some of these challenges?
Yeah, so there definitely are challenges. I think you can kind of chop them up into two categories. I guess you could kind of say when you're in the field flying challenges and kind of larger logistical challenges. So as far as localized small scale difficulties, we already talked about temperature, and that's a big deal. And it's probably not unlike anyone that operates in, say, the Southwest of the United States, or even really anywhere in the summer. Fortunately, it's not particularly humid. It is kind of a dry heat. It's not like a desert or anything like that. So, there are. It's not like a tropical rainforest in the summer where it's 110% humidity or anything. So it's just really just pure heat. And obviously that's hard on the body. But the biggest challenge is if you're doing subsequent flights, taking care of batteries, especially on the M600 where we're really pushing that platform. The batteries come off so hot, you have to cool them off before you can charge them. So
is that a blue cooler there? Is that used for, is that lunch or is that used for your battery
that might have been
storage?
lunch in that picture. I do believe at times we threw it under, but what we found worked best was literally just opening the doors to this van, which we used last time, which was a problem of a vehicle in a remote, rugged environment. But putting the batteries basically on the floor and providing air current was the best way. And then just having someone whose almost full-time job was managing the batteries and getting us the right set next and cooling off the next set and charging it. That's a logistical hurdle. And then the other kind of local challenge, honestly, is the animals to some degree. And the reason, a lot of people don't have the chance to go to, an African safari or anything like that. But in, Kruger National Park, which is huge game park, South Africa, I recommend everyone go for vacation. It's amazing. However many animals you're imagining, like in reference to what you'd see in North America, multiply it by like 10. And that's basically what you see all the time. It really is incredible. And most of the time the animals leave you alone. But there were some times where elephants would come up to the car while we were flying, particularly elephants. One time a buffalo was getting grunty at us. It didn't like us, didn't like it where we were. You have to think, the drone's in the air as an elephant here. It's a potentially dangerous situation. And the other thing you have to take into consideration is if you have pieces of equipment you have to leave throughout the landscape. So like for us, our GPS puck we use for post-processing kinematics.
The reference station, the base reference station.
Station.
Mm-hmm.
We would sometimes be able to leave it in gated camps if we were close enough to that camp where we were operating that day. And obviously that helps remove the threat of animals. But sometimes we couldn't do that. And it turned out that the only GPS pole, the survey pole we could get is very tall, bright, and yellow. And nothing else in the African savanna looks like that. And elephants are very curious. So there was at least twice, maybe 3 times, where an elephant was walking right up to the pole and we had to scare it away. It's just not a situation you want to be in. And there's just things you have to consider in that type of environment. And then bigger logistics. South Africa is a very developed country, like more than I think most Americans would just assume. There are parts of Kruger National Park. It's about the size of Israel. At least that's the number I hear. I've never checked. I mean, someone can check me on that, I guess. Where there's parts that are extremely remote. It might take you several hours to get out of the park and into like a more developed town. But if you're smart about it and you operate in the areas of the park that have more tourists and you're closer to full-size towns. I mean, there are towns 2 hours away from the main camp in Kruger that have shopping malls. Like they're it's not that remote. So it might take you 2 to 3 hours to get a part you missed if it's like something you can get at a hardware store. But those add up, right? So you can't really make mistakes. And the other issue is it is in Africa. Like you have a lot of UAS manufacturing and battery storage in like the United States, or they come from China. And it can take longer to get to you in a place like Kruger, right? So you probably could order batteries if you lost one or something to come to Kruger, but that might take a week out of your trip if that's really that important, right? So you really can't make the mistakes. There are logistical hurdles. There are issues if you are reliant on part of your team being in the United States and helping you out remotely and working in the field in Africa. There's a 7-hour time difference, or depending on East Coast time. So there are logistical hurdles, but probably not that different from operating somewhere like very remote in the contingent US. There are places we are planning to operate in Africa that are much more remote, and there's just no room for error.
So I assume checklists are critical.
Yes.
Making checklists and making sure you have all the parts you need. And
yes, I would say checklists are very critical. And the other thing, honestly, is really knowing your equipment, both limitations and how it actually works. Because you can end up in a situation. So something actually for us, we wanted 24 volts into our LiDAR sensor, and we realized we have 2 12-volt outputs from our drone, and we didn't have an adapter. So we had to make one, which isn't the most complicated thing in the world. You can do that fairly easily, but you have to know to do that, right? You have to know that that's your problem, that you need 24 volts and you only have 12 and 2 different outputs. But you have to know how to actually make it, right? So there is sort of this, you need a team that understands the equipment, I would say. It's very key in this part of it.
Gotcha. And then I see that you're viewing your data in real time using Spatial Explorer, is that pretty helpful to make sure you're collecting LiDAR where you want, and making sure you have that data, and also showing the image frusтрums in real time, and making sure you can see which data you're collecting?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we really like the Spatial Explorer in the context of it gives you a level of situational awareness, not only on data quality. Like there are times where maybe you can tell you aren't collecting data, or you can figure out you're having an issue, and maybe it would have taken you days without it to diagnose that issue. But another really big advantage we found is that when you're flying multiple flights, where you're not turning off the sensor, but you're turning off the aircraft, and it's potentially, it's resetting the aircraft, there's an advantage in having telemetry information that is consistent, that it hasn't restarted, it doesn't have a change in starting and ending altitude, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because, so we now have beyond visual line of sight permission, but we did not when we first worked. So there are times we actually had to fly from a moving vehicle, potentially down up terrain, land the drone somewhere else, restart it. So now it has a new 0 point, but the flight software assumed the same altitude, which means you potentially run the risk of running into terrain because there's all these different changes in altitude on some things, but not others. So it was super useful to have the LiDAR unit and Spatial Explorer, like, to kind of add a level of confidence that we're actually at the right altitudes and stuff like that. So yeah, the downlink is really useful in many ways.
Awesome. So let's move on to, I think, what most people are most excited about, and that is how is LiDAR best leveraged in animal ecology, and what is the most valuable data products that you're deriving from your integrated LiDAR system?
Yeah, both really good questions. Okay, so the first one, kind of put perspective on like what I'm thinking about when it's like what sensor to pick, LiDAR otherwise, and the resolutions we need and such. Animals themselves are small. Their features are usually smaller than they are that we want to measure. And we want to measure big areas, right? So what you really need to do is take the landscape home with you. And the more information you can take of that, both in resolution, as well as dimensions, the more aspects of the landscape you can take home with you, the more you're going to be able to say about how animals are interacting with that landscape. So LiDAR is really only one dimension. It's the structure of the landscape. It tells us how the topography is different in different places. It can tell us tree height, find canopy gaps. It can tell us what's really neat that we can do that's kind of new, no one's really been doing, is we can actually measure the grass layer, which you need very high resolution for. So the more resolution you have, the more detail you can have. I mean, on the right and the left are two colorized point clouds. And kind of this is a good example of actually this dimension concept. Another dimension we can measure is the color of the landscape, at least to human eyes or mammal eyes. And what does it look like? Animals respond to that, but it's also useful for us to be like, we can actually now tell that tree there is a dead tree instead of just and in the bottom image, instead of just a tree. We can clearly see the road. You can see the grass layer. By color, we can also measure its structure. But that it really helps kind of verify the LiDAR, for us. And basically the really high resolution, large scale LiDAR approach that we can get with some of these drone techniques we're using basically lets us take home an incredible depth of information regarding structure of the landscape. And that's really key. As far as products go, because we kind of do research, we kind of can juggle all sorts of different types of products. We don't have like a set product I'd say we'd use, but I would say pretty much we either use point clouds, digital terrain models, so that's without the vegetation, the surface of the earth, digital surface models, which is the highest value for given pixels anywhere, and canopy height models, which tells us the height of the vegetation. You pretty much use those or some sort of fancy product that's derived from one of those further downstream. I would say is our typical
Awesome.
Go-to with LiDAR.
I really like what you said about taking the landscape home with you. Yeah, that's really important. Yeah, it's cool that you can just collect everything, have the 3D aspect, the color aspect, even the thermal aspect, and then bring it back to the office with you and revisit the African savanna. I think that's great.
Yeah.
This lower right digital terrain model. What are all these little mounds that we're seeing in there?
Yes, what a good lead in. So this bottom right it's a digital terrain model. So it's just the surface of the Earth. First, you may notice those roads. We'll talk more about what these are later, but those things in the middle are burn plots. So they're treatments where they're intentionally set fire to. We'll talk more about fire in the savanna when we get to kind of like what we're currently working on. But all those little pimply things are termite mounds, which we'll also come back to. But it's kind of a take a look at those, who they look like. Those things are actually enormous. Some of those in this plot are about 35 to 50 feet across.
Wow.
So they are huge. We'll come back to that. It's kind of a taster.
Yeah,
later.
a little bit of a teaser there, huh?
Yeah.
So when it comes to vegetation structure, when you're analyzing that, I see what looks to be vegetation segmentation and drawing polygons around different types of vegetation. Tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing here and some of the information you can extract from LiDAR.
Yeah, so I first wanted to show this top right image. That's just a height, a canopy height model. I kind of want to show what those look like because the bottom image is derived from that. This whole slide is to kind of show you like the benefit of extremely high resolution LiDAR. So this bottom right image, the pink kind of layer on the bottom is just the surface of the Earth. But all those different colors, each one of those is a distinct shrub or tree. I think they're all shrubs in that particular image. And basically, when you have such high resolution, you can do object-based classification and segment out individual plants. And actually, the image on the left is just shapefile versions of that. You can then extrapolate essentially a polygon of the canopy. And they kind of show that at a certain point, you can get so much data and so much resolution that we can tell how, if say we flew this area again, we can see how individual plants change over time, either due to fire or animal movements. This has been done for trees, but no one really does it at this resolution, at this scale of, on the shrub level. Pretty much all woody vegetation we can do it to, even probably, if you haven't tried it, probably tufts of grass even. And kind of highlighting the advantages of this ability to pull out structure at such a level where we can get the individual pieces of vegetation can be really powerful. And kind of an example of like a downstream product. It's kind of also an answer to the previous question, I guess, of what products we use. We eventually can turn these conventional products into a little bit more complicated outcomes, I guess.
Absolutely. So you also have, as you mentioned before, you have a thermal camera on your integrated system. Tell us a little bit about what we're seeing in this image on the left and this colorized point cloud on the right. What kind of animals are those? Those little hot spots, those white spots there.
Yeah, all those little dots are impala. So they are a very herd focused. You see them in big groups. They are probably one of the most common things you see in Kruger National Park. It's by the end, you run into tourists and they get excited to tell you, oh, there's an elephant over there. Make sure you check it out. When someone says there's impala over there, they just got in the park. They just showed up. They are quite literally everywhere. But you can see very small mammals, no problem with this thermal. And the reason I have this image on the left is there's a pretty obvious use, I guess, for thermal, and that's object ID. And in a sense, that's what everyone uses it for, finding cracks in power lines. I don't know. I'm not that type of thermal user, but stuff like that, But there's this other dimension that I'm really excited about, and I think people in the lab are really excited about, and it's that you can add a dimension to the landscape with thermal. This idea that you can pull out temperature. And the truth of the matter is animals and temperature are very, they respond very drastically to different thermal conditions. Humans do this. If anyone's been to Disneyland when it's 110 in Southern California, you go get a drink or you go inside on a ride. You don't stand outside out in the heat. And the same thing goes for animals. And temperature determines a lot of how they move across the landscape. Things like shade are incredibly important. Or you could also think of it as impacts of things like elephants or large animals that knock down trees, creating gaps in the canopy. They effectively increase the temperature of the ground where there was a tree previously, change the soil conditions, so on and so forth. So this temperature aspect of a landscape can really drive both directions of this animal landscape interaction paradigm. And it's kind of a new concept. There's not a lot out there, certainly not with drone-based thermal, and definitely not drone-based thermal LiDAR integration. This is a thermal encoded point cloud on the right. But we haven't done much with it yet, but I think you can, I guess, expect into the future some more stuff here. I'm excited.
Absolutely. That's exciting. So yeah, let's move on to all of your current projects. So you talked about the termite mound before, and I see that you're standing next to a large mound here. Is this one of those 35-foot in diameter termite mounds that you were speaking of?
Yeah, it's probably that big. I mean, it was big enough for me to take a picture next to it. So I do believe I believe I saw it. I was like, oh man, that's a big one. Yeah, so termites are really cool. So I'm gonna talk about a couple of projects that are ongoing. Truthfully, we have a lot of stuff coming up. So these are just kind of two that are a little bit more underway than others. And yeah, so termite mounds, this is a project I'm really leading up, I suppose. And termite mounds are really cool. They come in lots of sizes. They're different by rainfall gradients and geologic gradients. So different types of soil really influence termite mound size. So I am showing you some of the bigger ones, but they are really important. And most people think termites, that they're gross, they suck, they eat the bottom of your house or whatever. But they are incredibly important for African savanna systems, and especially arid savannas that are very dry, and nutrient poor savannas, which are the southern portions of Kruger National Park. And the reason is they make these big giant mounds out of predominantly clay. And clay is fantastic at holding water, and it's fantastic at holding nutrients. And they also dig so far down that they pull water out of the water table. So they create essentially—
They create a well.
Yeah, basically.
Wow.
Yeah. So they create these islands of nutrients and water, and that promote growth of vegetation, especially during things like the dry season, where most of the landscape is extremely dry. They don't really get rain in the northern hemisphere summer, southern hemisphere winter in these savanna systems. So yeah, so very much well-like, and it promotes growth of vegetation, actually a totally different community of vegetation than what you would find usually where you find termite mounds. It's actually very similar to what you'd find on the edges of rivers. And this vegetation is crucial for things like grazing during the dry season. Animals come and eat all the vegetation on top of them. They really sustain a lot of the animal community. And the other really important thing, and you can really see it in this left image, which is actually a slope model. They really pop out in slope models of a DTM. I don't know why I chose this image. There's this weird hill thing in the middle. That is not a giant termite mound. All those little— I was curious though. yeah, that's not one. All those little circles are termite mounds. They're fairly big ones. And what you notice is that they're fairly evenly spaced apart. And the reason for this is resource competition. So the individual mounds, their communities fight for resources with one another, and it more or less forces them into very, very even spacing, what is called over-dispersal in ecology. And it's probably one of the best examples of over-dispersal in nature. It's quite incredible how well they do this. And what's really important about that is, so these termite mounds are ecosystem engineers. These termites, they have these hotspot wells, if you will, of islands of nutrients. And that effect extends some distance away from the mound. The size of the mound determines how far that extends and the magnitude of that effect. But on average, it's about 30 meters. So for about 30 meters off this mound, you have a hotspot of nutrients. And basically by being evenly spaced apart, those nutrients cover the maximum amount of landscape. And this makes intuitive sense, because if the termite mounds were clumped, then basically you'd have a super high concentration of nutrient in an area, but further away from the mounds, you'd have less. So by evenly spreading out the termite mound, you're evenly spreading out the effect, and you're maximizing the amount of the landscape that are influenced by termites. At least on smaller scales, there's some complexity regarding where termite mounds are at larger scales. But at smaller scales, they have this effect. And so this is really important. This drives a lot of processes in savannas. However, there is another really important ecosystem engineer in savannas. There's many, but another important one is fire. And fire is essentially a non-living engineer. It's a disturbance. It consumes vegetation. It essentially helps turnover of grass layer, limits tree layer development, and essentially temporarily depletes resources. And no one has really thought about how fire interacts with the distribution and size, and thus the magnitude of the effect, of termite mounds. There are reasons why they could. Maybe really small mounds get burnt up, so more frequent fire areas, they lose more termite mounds. Maybe they eat up resources, so it affects the pattern of distribution of the termite mounds. And no one's really looked into that, but it's a really important question because fire regimes are changing, both due to human management, climate change, you name it. There are reasons why these fire regimes are changing, and no one's taken the time to understand how termite mounds themselves interact with fire. Essentially, how one ecosystem engineer affects another and its effects. So basically, we flew over all these burn plots. So you might notice these little like grids, more or less, in the image on the left. Each one of those is a different fire treatment, so they're burned at different frequency. Most of them are controlled, so they're never burnt every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, and there's a few, so on and so forth. And so we're really taking the time to understand how termite mounds are affected, are structurally different due to the effects of fire. And then there very likely will be a project down the road on how does the actual impact of termite mounds on the landscape differ because of this effect. That's that project. And then there's one other.
Oh, go ahead.
Questions on that, actually. This is a good time.
Oh, I was just curious. So you mentioned that you were mapping these fires, but did you mention that you were actively flying over these fires in real time, like as the fires are burning? Are you allowed to say that?
Yeah, no worries. So that's for the termite project, no. However,
that's your other project.
Yes. So there's another project, which is, that's a lead into this, I suppose, that we just finished the field work for. And it also involves fire. I think it's very timely in the world. You have these fires, they're actually forest fires. We're studying savannas, but these fires in forests in North America and Australia, and there's all these questions. Is it, how much of it's climate, how much of it's management? And really it's some proportion of both. And we have another project where it's really to study the process of fire itself. So people have studied to some degree fire, areas before fire, areas after fire, and then basically interpreting what the effects of fire was in between this pre-fire condition and this post-fire condition. It's very difficult to actually understand what's happening in the middle. How it is, because fire, you think of it like, okay, this area burned, but it's not that simple. Fire has variability. There's areas of a fire that are more intense. There are areas that may move differently due to features on the landscape. How does that relate to, how is that variability driven by the biodiversity, or sorry, the biomass, the plant material that was there before? And then what are the outcomes of that variability? And no one's really taken the time until us. So we flew very, very high resolution LiDAR surveys before and after a fire. We estimate we're going to get about 1,000 points per meter in both of those treatments, both of those flights rather. And then we actually flew during a fire as well. And we had our thermal camera on, and we're basically we took images very frequently, I believe once every 2 seconds or so. And the goal is to basically see how the intensity and the variability in the fire itself changes both as response to the structure before, but also then how it drives the structure after. So we can kind of answer what's going on in that black box, and then what's going to happen. We did it across different climate conditions, different geology in the park. So there's a drier end of the park and a, I guess, more moist end of the park. So you can see like some climatic differences are different, and different types of savanna going on within the park. There's lots of different burn plots. So you can kind of drive home this relationship and then make predictions about what is it going to look like in the future when fire regimes change, either due to human management, fire suppression, or things like climate.
I'm looking forward to hearing the results or seeing the results from that study. It sounds really exciting.
Yeah, I think so too. We don't have any results on either of those projects yet to share. So, just keep your eyes open, I guess, if you're interested into the future.
Well, that's a good segue into your future projects. Let's see here. So your projects that are coming soon, I see that you have interest in the VTOL platform, vertical takeoff and landing, and there's also another project in a national park, and maybe the same project in the Republic of Congo. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I guess the fixed wing first. So kind of, this is not all of our stuff in kind of coming soon. So we have people interested in a huge variety of questions. There'll be work on hippos coming in our near future, rhino type work. We have people interested in understanding how predators in the landscape respond to humans. So like we have lots of stuff. So this Adzala point is more like me specific. We'll get there in a second. But this fixed wing VTOL, first and foremost. So our area coverage and really our efficiencies are pretty much limited to multi-rotors right now. So we get 25 to 30 minutes of flight time with our new Alta. And we've also picked up efficiencies in processing the fewer flights we do, because one of those, I guess, slower ends of our processing chain is the actual trajectory processing. And the more flights you add, the longer that takes. So we wanted to cover more area than we currently can and essentially do it in fewer flights. So we have a faster processing chain. And a good way to do that is with a fixed wing aircraft, but because we operate in really rugged environments, sometimes very remote environments, we need VTOL capability. So we've partnered with a company called Carbonics in Australia. They make high performance VTOL UAVs. I can't go too much into the details because we're actually developing it with them essentially, and we're under non-disclosure agreements, and
Okay.
we can't talk too much. But basically, the goal is to get multi-hour flight time, large area coverage, where we go from the Alta, we get about 1,000 hectares a day at the maximum to several thousand in a few hours, to really push that number. And really the first place we're going to test this is in Adzala National Park, or Adzala-Kakua National Park in the Republic of Congo. This is going to be kind of, I guess, like out of all the projects, it's going to be kind of my baby. It's going to be my dissertation, hopefully, assuming everything works out. And Adzala is a tropical rainforest in the middle of the Congo rainforest in Central Africa. And these systems are very interesting. The Congo is the second largest tropical rainforest in the world, but it's considered the quote unquote, you hear it in the literature, odd man out of the tropical forests. And the reason is it has substantially fewer trees than any other tropical forest, but the trees on average are dramatically larger. They are very large tree species in the Congo, and allows them to store a lot more carbon. So they're very important in this kind of climate mitigation framework that a lot of ecology and a lot of environmental science looks at. And there's some ideas as to why, and a lot of the ideas are centered around the fact that Central Africa, and the rainforest of Central Africa, still have their what are called megafauna, they're big animals, whereas pretty much all the other tropical rainforests in the world lost them when humans arrived. And the effect here is essentially, the thought is that these big animals are interacting somehow to affect the carbon landscape of the Congo. And so that's a big area of what my project's more or less going to be in this area. So what we're going to do, it's going to be lots of things. We're going to look at sea dispersal and dung analyses and all of these fancy techniques. But a big portion of this project is to understand how 3 ecosystem engineers, central chimpanzees, African forest elephants, and gorillas are actually modifying the environment, not only as individuals, but as a community of ecosystem engineers. And there's essentially a thought, I won't go too much into the details, just for the sake of time. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. But the thought is that elephants, through creation of trail systems, which can last hundreds of years due to reuse in forests, are affecting the distribution of gorillas and chimpanzees, which through both physical modification as well as dispersal of giant tree species, are all 3 of these species really, because they all eat fruit, are creating an environment spatially structured around elephant trails that is ideal for giant tree species. So we're going to investigate this with LiDAR. I think we're going to do what has to be one of the largest drone surveys, at least in ecology. We're going to hopefully survey about 400,000 hectares directly with UAV. And then we're actually going to blow this up into spaceborne sensors. We're going to do what's called allometry to turn a canopy height model into a carbon model, a carbon estimate. And we're going to blow that up with a spaceborne sensor on the International Space Station called JEDI, to take essentially an estimate of carbon at a subpixel level for the entire region. And then we're going to attribute that to these 3 animals through their effects that we're going to measure on earlier projects. This whole process is going to take like 5 years, so they'll be done in parts. It's really like a research program, probably more than a research project, but really excited for that going forward.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating, and we're excited to hear updates. So I hope you keep us posted.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Evan, for sharing all of your current research and your projects to come soon. And I think this is a good stopping point for to move on to get some questions answered. So I'll hand it back to Lido to ask some questions that we have from our attendees.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions here. The first one is, what altitude do you generally fly at, and what circumstances would dictate you making a change in flying in near altitudes?
Yeah, so very good question. And so we actually, what's really nice, so South Africa is an interesting country drone regulation wise. It's actually much more difficult to do anything than in the US. The process is extremely complicated. However, if you go through the proper channels and steps, you can actually do a lot more than you can do in the US. So we actually have above 400 feet permissions. We have beyond visual line of sight and at night flying permissions. So we're not limited to 400 feet. So we generally fly at 100 meters to 125 to 150 meters, depending on what we're doing. If we want really high resolution, 50 to 60 meters has been our like super sweet spot. What causes us to change elevation is actually the type of survey. So we actually have kind of more or less mentally broken down, like, is this just a wide area survey? Is this a specific like site survey? Do we want to know information about a specific feature? And that more or less drives our decision-making, as well as comparability. So for example, our first trip, we did the burn plots we measured all the burn plots at 100 meters. So we do the burn plots at 100 meters still. It's just a matter of, it helps the time series perspective. But things like obstacles could affect that. If we can do, there are reasons why, depending on the aircraft. You don't need to get into them, but if we can do terrain following or not matters on altitude elevation choices. It kind of really depends. But we get really great results with really fantastic point densities for scientific purposes at 100 to 150 meters. We're still getting somewhere around, I believe, 100 points per meter a lot of the time.
Excellent. That's some good results you're getting out of the LR. That's very
Yeah.
good. Next question I have is, what kind of replacement parts would you typically bring with a field operation?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. And I wish I had a straightforward answer because literally we've used a different aircraft both times we've been in the field so far. I don't really have one. Extra propellers if we have them. It really depends on the platform. And to be honest, I think we travel pretty light as far as extra parts go, which is a risky move. We travel lots of extra wires and parts to essentially make wires with different lengths if we needed them. That's really mostly it. That's going to change with this VTOL aircraft. I think we're basically getting a second aircraft and extra parts. And the reason is because of remoteness. Operating in Kruger National Park is remote enough to be a problem if you need new stuff, but not such a problem to where your 3-month project is done if something breaks. That's going to be different in a place like Odzala. Odzala, you need to take a bush plane to get there. Like you're just plain and simply is not a way to Amazon one day ship yourself anything important. So I think it's going to really be variable by location. What we do travel pretty light, I think, in the extra part category.
Yeah, you had mentioned a little bit about your workflow. One of our viewers is asking, what's your data processing like, and what types of specific analysis techniques, both automated and manual, do you use for the data that you've collected?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Processing-wise, we essentially use the full suite of softwares that were given to us from Phoenix. So Spatial Explorer, we essentially process in stages. We have a couple individuals, I actually think they're both on this call, that really focus on processing the data. We do it per site. So basically when we do a flight, we don't do it per flight. We essentially establish a specific set of flights encompass a site, and maybe it's a string of burn plots, maybe it's an animal exposure, something along those lines. And we really focus and kind of hammer home those between trajectory processing and the whole pipeline through making point clouds, TerraSolid and whatnot, making the models in TerraSolid and whatnot. And it's mostly a fairly manual process. We've talked about the potential of eventually moving to a script-based procedure. At least I have a couple individuals. I don't know the timeline on that or if we will. We've been pretty happy with the results so far with TerraSolid, but it takes time. And this is kind of the whole point about, minimizing the number of flights, because I believe it takes us pretty much a week to do a site. And we did, I think, something like 25 sites in 20 days or something along those lines on our first trip. That's a lot of time. That's pretty much half a year to do 20 days of flying work, right? So cutting back that number of flights is huge. And was there a second end of that question? Sorry, I forgot it if so.
No, that was pretty much it.
All right, cool.
Yeah. And we do have one more comment and question. Fantastic presentation. Could this be applied to forest composition changes based on predator-prey relationship? For example, impacting food source like beaver and elk, which could lead to vegetation and landscape changes. How do you see that your research affecting that or answering those questions?
That is a fantastic question. And the answer is absolutely yes. What you're describing is essentially what's called a trophic cascade. And it's where trophic levels are, if you remember back to, I don't know, what would it be? Freshman year high school biology. You remember seeing that like either a pyramid or a food web, and higher things on that pyramid, there are fewer of them, but as they eat and affect things, they drive changes further down. You can absolutely measure these effects. You do have to be able to know the condition of the predator-prey relationship in that area. But that's a big topic, and it's an area that I think we absolutely will be exploring with certain people in our lab that are interested, especially in predator relationships. But basically, of course, so a good example of this, the famous example, is in Yellowstone. They didn't have wolves for a long time. They were eliminated, I believe, in either the very end of the 1800s or the very beginning of the 1900s, and the entire landscape changed. Beaver left, elk and deer ran rampant, and then all these plants were lost. They reintroduced wolves. All of those other animals came back. The system essentially restored itself. So these top-down, they're called top-down relationships, are really crucial, and we absolutely can measure these things without a doubt. These relationships. And in fact, I think it's going to become very much a cornerstone of topics for us. They are absolutely in the line of animal landscape interactions. And there's this interesting conversation. You don't see it that much, but some people will say that predators are not ecosystem engineers because they don't directly modify the environment, but they do so through their behavior. And they actually also do so through a thing called the landscape of fear. So these type of predators actually essentially create fear in prey animals, and that changes their behavior. It scares them away from certain areas, and the vegetation will change in those areas due to a loss of herbivory, even without physically eating and killing those animals. So there's really cool stuff in this realm of question. That's a fantastic question.
And I have one more question, and this one is actually from me. So you'd mentioned elephant trails, as being having significant effect on the ecology of an area, and then acting as engineers. Is this due more to their local water and feeding trails, or major migration paths? Do they have equal effect, or does one have more of an effect than another?
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about that. So local trails. They're probably different. So local trails are more sustained, and it depends on the environment. So trails are more useful in systems that have more resistance when you're off trails. So if you're in an environment that is very difficult for an animal to move, just due to the amount of energy it would cost for them to move through it, or potentially injury or something along that lines, trails are more important. Migrating trails are a little bit different. They probably, if they're short-term migrations, if they're like every month an animal's going back and forth, they probably work more like local trails. But migrations are extremely crucial. And actually there's this point, and it's kind of one of these things I guess I alluded to, like how do animals shape global processes? There's been work done in East Africa on these giant herds of wildebeest that move through the Serengeti. And everyone's seen it, you see the videos of them crossing the rivers and the crocodiles eating them and whatnot. But these big migrations, they eat the grass as they move, and they deposit all that grassy material that they don't absorb in their dung underground, which then gets embedded in the soil until more plants can take it up. Well, in some areas, they've lost those wildebeest. In particular, outside of the Serengeti, for example. And the grass layer then is never eaten, but it needs to be disturbed still. It needs to be essentially cut down so that way woody vegetation does not overpower it. So what happens is it dries out, it dies, and then it catches fire. And that's beneficial to the grass. It's what it essentially wants to do if you can anthropomorphize it. But what happens is all that all that grass material that gets deposited in the soil has a lot of carbon. Whereas if it catches fire, instead of being eaten by wildebeest, it gets emitted into the air. And there's actually a study that's tried to figure out how much carbon is emitted to the air that would have been deposited in the soil. And there are big error bars on this. Don't get me wrong, it's not a sure, exact number. The study estimates that as much carbon as is emitted by the entire fossil fuel usage in Eastern Africa is deposited into soils by wildebeest. So if you lost them, it'd be the same thing as doubling the fossil fuel usage in the eastern end of the entire continent, right? So these animals can have really huge effects. And that's an example of these like migratory species that have a very profound effect because there are such huge migrations, but they're also annual. They're not the same thing as kind of constant back and forth. And I don't think anyone has looked at, are small, is the aggregate of small local effects equal or less than one gigantic monstrous migration along some sort of a climate gradient like they do. They essentially follow the green grass as they migrate. So good question.
Great, thanks for answering that, and thank you for answering the other listener questions. That's all we have on the list here. Corey, do you have anything you want to follow up with or close up with?
I think I'm good. I just want to say thank you, Evan, for being a part of this webinar and for presenting and sharing your insights on LiDAR applications in animal ecology. Yeah, it's been fascinating.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me. I love talking about this stuff. I could talk about it all day. So anytime, and I'm sure, I'm actually positive, because actually Andrew told me that other people in the lab would be happy to do more of these as we have new discoveries in the future and whatnot.
Sounds good. Well, we'll have to have you back on once the fire mapping analysis is completed. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, sounds great.
All
right. Well,
we'll
thank
hand
you
it back to Lido.
Thank you very much, Evan. That really was a great presentation. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Corey, for hosting this. And if any of you want to see a replay of this presentation, we will have it on our website, phoenixlidar.com, in about a week. There'll be a link to it in our news section. And if you have any more questions about our systems or what Phoenix LiDAR does, please contact info@phoenixlidar.com or sales@phoenixlidar.com. Thank you very much. This concludes today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in a few weeks for the next one.